Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Gabriella Gallagher, National Chair of Canadian Friends of Peace Now. Our organization is the Canadian partner to Peace Now, Shalom Achshav, which is Israel's leading peace movement and which promotes the two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You can find out more about us on our website, peacenowcanada.org. We really hope you will consider supporting us with a donation, which you can do via our website. Just go to the donate page. We rely entirely on donations from people like you. Later on, we'll have time for audience questions. Please type your questions at any time using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please make your question as concise as you can. Our webinar is being recorded and posted to our website. And now it is a great honor to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Shira Ephron. Dr. Ephron is the Senior Policy Researcher at the Israel Policy Forum. She has spent over 15 years in prominent think tanks, including the RAND Corporation, the Center for American Progress, the Middle East Institute, and the Tel Aviv-based Institute for National Security Studies. She was previously a consultant with the UN country team in Jerusalem, where she focused on access and movement issues in Gaza. She has many more stellar achievements in her bio, but we want to get to the webinar without delay. So I'm going to turn it over. Our moderator today is Shayna Wise-Till, a Canadian Friends of Peace Now board member in Toronto. Shayna, over to you.
Hi, thanks so much, Gabriella, and thank you, Shira, for joining us. I'll kick us off with the first question. So there are conflicting reports from the UN, Israel, and other bodies about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Can you tell us a little bit about what the situation actually looks like and how it's evolved since the beginning of the war?
Hi there. It's very difficult because I think there's not a sense of deconflicting reports on the data themselves, but on the interpretation. And there are different voices who speak, while the UN International Humanitarian Community will speak about a humanitarian catastrophe. Israel said, well, in fact, humanitarian situation is difficult, but we don't have a crisis. If you want, I'll just give a nutshell of what's reported out there. Some things are more in dispute by Israel, some others are not. I think when it comes to the death toll, there's some questions on the body counts and especially how it's divided between civilians and militants. But we're talking about around 42,000 people who are dead. According to most counts, it's primarily civilians, women and children. The injuries stand at over 90,000. 87 to 89% of Gaza's population is displaced. Many are displaced more than once. We are talking about, of course, children who have not been to school in a year. Infectious diseases, a sanitation crisis, illnesses that we are seeing in high numbers. We could talk about like hepatitis A. There was a polio. Polio was detected in Gaza. However, I think this marks like a positive instance of cooperation between Israel and the international community, where it was able to contain the polio. In fact, they're doing the second round of inoculation as we speak now. But the situation is pretty grim, and the way it evolved, right, is Gaza was never I wouldn't say Gaza was a flourishing place before, right? Definitely not the standards we're used to in the Western world, but it was a place where people mostly lived in homes and there was running water. The quality wasn't great, but there was running water all the time, and there was electricity, not all the time, but big parts of the time, more than 50% of the time, depending on when we looked. And what happened gradually since over the past year is that slowly we've been seeing obviously less and less food, because self-production farming disappeared, and there's more limit on food that enters Gaza. Obviously, there were more imports before. Sanitation crisis that stems from the fact that there's just not enough energy. But also, it's a war zone, right? There's a lot of infrastructure that's getting damaged in the fighting itself, and spare parts. I mean, we can go into every sewage treatment and talk about why it's not working. And I think if, we're speaking to you in Canada, and I see you wear a short sleeve shirt, but I'm sure, when you talk about winter in Canada, it's a very different winter that we have here. It's a very mild winter in Gaza, but still it's a winter. And if I compare the winter now, or the winter that's coming, and the winter that we had last year, it's going to be very, very different, because last year, most of Gaza's population lived in their homes. When we're talking about 2 million people who are in tents. And even in a mild winter, when you have no infrastructure for absorbing rain, when people live on the Moasi, which is considered the humanitarian zone, close to the coastal area on agricultural land, when they are in tents without heating, without proper clothing, you can only imagine what this means. So unfortunately, I think that the situation continues to deteriorate, although we did see moments of positive advances and vectors, and I do hope we're in a moment of change now due to events we saw last week and some pressure from the U.S. administration. And I'm sure we can talk about that, but the situation is not pretty in Gaza. No way we describe the data, and no matter what your interpretation is, the situation is not pretty.
Thank you for that. So what are some of the challenges in procuring and delivering this aid to civilians in Gaza, and who's to blame if the aid is not reaching the right people?
Oh, good. Okay, so I will say that first, in terms of who's to blame, I think, and we spoke about it a little bit before we started the webinar, there is a blame game happening between sort of the humanitarian community and Israel and the UN and Hamas and Egypt. And I just feel that the blame game is really not constructive. In a sense, the humanitarian situation in Gaza represents what I would describe as a collective failure. Of course, not everyone holds equal responsibility or an equal fault, but it does represent a collective failure of all the actors. And we can speak about the variety of problems. What Israel, let's imagine, right? Like I don't have a whiteboard here, but if I had to draw this, right? We have a donor in country X, okay, let's say Austria, I don't know, the Emirates, whatever, just like a country. And then it's supposed to get somewhere, and it doesn't get into Gaza, right? The aid, the supplies, and it's not money. It comes in actual like boxes and goods that have to be inspected. It can get to either to Israel or to Egypt. Mostly stuff still gets to Egypt for no good reason, because the crossing with Egypt is closed. And then it's supposed to travel and go through a prioritization process and monitoring and inspection. There's a lot of corruption involved, and like stuff disappears, and and traffic and roads, and it's supposed to travel to Israel. And then there is the crossing. There's a main crossing, it's called Kerem Shalom, but there are a few other small crossings. And then there's from the crossing, how it gets to the actual beneficiary in the end. Now, I think what Israel does, the body inside Israel, the IDF that deals with it, it's COGAT, the coordinator of government activities for the territories. They're very professional, right? But they're very good at like looking just at the crossing itself. How do we make sure what needs to, or what we coordinate goes through one side of the crossing to the other side of the crossing? But what's happening here and here is the big, big, big problem. We have donor fatigue. We have this whole Egypt black box of how does stuff get prioritized, monitored, travels from El Arish all the way, and it's a mess. Then we have this, not that the crossings from Israel to Gaza are perfect, but far from it, but it's more of a technical problem here. Then once it gets to the Gazan side of the crossing, Israel's like, okay, that's not our problem, it's the UN's problem. The UN, for a variety of reasons, some objective, some subjective, senses that they cannot protect the aid and their aid workers inside of Gaza because of the security situation. They're threatened by those challenges stemming from the war, so from encounters with the IDF, with Hamas that continues to siphon off aid, and looters that have to do with either with Hamas or not with Hamas, who threaten the lives and hurt and injure and kill and rob aid workers. So if I was to think like, and everyone along this sort of like humanitarian supply chain can do better, but it's more like in the prioritization of aid, how to make sure that the aid that's most needed arrives there, the routes, the crossings themselves, increasing it, protecting aid and aid workers, the distribution, what's going to be procured, and this idea that everything here is really technical, but it's not technical. So much of it is political, and it's politicized by all sides. So I think also where I would put a lot of responsibility on Israel, I'm trying not to get into the international legal arguments, but I do think that Israel's reluctance to discuss any day after plan and think who is going to be responsible for managing Gaza's civilian affairs doesn't incentivize the different players to work toward Israel and go and compromise on these things, because there's always a sense or a fear that Israel wants to secretly like reoccupy Gaza, but have someone else pay for the civilian toll, or be responsible for the civilian population. And we have international communities reluctant to do that. So what's sad is that the same problems I at least examined and analyzed in November a year ago are still persistent today, but obviously with a much worse situation inside Gaza.
Right, thank you. And so just to go into a little bit more detail on that, we heard reports last week from the UN that no aid had reached northern Gaza since beginning of October. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that and maybe paint us a little bit of a picture of how much aid is going into Gaza now versus how much was going in before the war and what those numbers look like.
So it's hard to talk about before the war, because before the war, we were talking about like 500, 600 trucks per day. We're talking about there were days even more, but not everything was sort of humanitarian aid, right? Like people would order, I don't know, dishwashers. How do we count this? Obviously, those things are not going in, but there was a capacity. What we are looking at here, I'm just trying to find the right numbers and okay, I'm just trying to sorry, I'm looking at something because I don't want to, maybe I'll just give you ballpark. So don't kind of catch me by the actual number. But what we are looking at is that we were talking about around 500 trucks per day, and everyone, when you looked at like ceasefire terms of ceasefire, everyone was talking about the need, or the US was pushing to increasing the number of trucks to go into 500, 600 per day. In practice, after October 7, there were no trucks going in, and then more trucks started coming in through Egypt. And throughout time, because of unfortunate event, if you remember, the IDF, by mistake, identifying World Central Kitchen, WCK employees as terrorists. And there were a lot of like things that made Israel change course and increase the number of trucks, and also open its own crossings. And I remember when I was looking at it anyway, between late February, the end of February, and until Israel went into Rafah, which is June, I think, we're talking about 200, 250 trucks per day, which was a big difference, right? There was from Rafah and from Kerem Shalom. the Israeli crossing. What happened is when Israel started its incursion in Rafah, Egypt closed the crossing. They did warn in advance, and they said they would not reopen it if on the other side of the crossing there are no Palestinians. They don't want to see Israeli tanks on the other side of the crossing. Israel was reluctant to do that. And so where we are now, so where we were if you look then, you'd see a decline in the number of trucks. We were in good days in September, I think at around 130, maybe 140. What happened in October, and this is not just like UN reports, you can go to the COGAT, the IDF website, where there's a count of the trucks, and there are no trucks in October. So it's not that the UN, this is not a controversy. I think what the UN is saying, they're blaming Israel on deliberately putting a siege and not and deliberately on purpose preventing aid from going into northern Gaza, where Israel says, no, we had a military operation in Jabalia, northern Gaza, because Hamas reemerged there. We had Yom Kippur and other Jewish holidays, and it's just a coincidence that all these tactical circumstances came into a few days with no aid. But really, the directive has not changed. And I think this is where the discrepancies between the two. But in terms of the aid that mostly didn't go in, I mean, it's on the IDF's website. So there's not much dispute there. What we are seeing is that in response to the letter that was sent that Austin signed and then Biden will sign with, and we can go into the language that was there. There wasn't and I don't know if it was, we don't know what would have happened otherwise, but there's a major, Israel takes this language very, very seriously, and we already see more trucks coming in already. And the prime minister reportedly said that he wants to see at least 250 trucks going in every day. The letter spoke about a different number, I think 350. But the thing is, it's not that easy. We don't have a magic bullet. There are no, and here, actually, I don't know how technical you want me to go, but like one issue is the way aid goes in at the moment is in a back-to-back system, right? So there's an Israeli truck or an Egyptian truck, but it's a truck that goes in, inspected, it empties its load, and the load is and you know, sort of the it's all up. It goes up on a truck of the UN or a private or a merchant inside Gaza and distributed physically. There are not 250 trucks in Gaza physically. Okay, so even if so it's not that easy. I think people just throw in numbers and talk about numbers of trucks because we don't have much better metrics, but really we should measure outcomes and less trucks, because if I had warehouses right all over Gaza and you can pre-position aid, then you need less just trucks coming in. So that's an option also. There are issues with theft and looting and all these other things, but it's not that easy. We can't just wave a magic wand and make it happen. But realization that it's needed and moving in the direction, I think, is a positive change that we're hearing from Israel. And I hope with that will also come an improved effort from the UN to work with Israel to improve the distribution mechanisms.
For sure, thank you. I think we've talked kind of about it a couple of times, so I'd love to go into it a bit more explicitly. The US has threatened to withhold weapons deliveries to Israel if Israel does not improve the flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza by mid-November, and I'm curious what your thoughts are about the impact this ultimatum might have.
Listen, I know also IPF is not an organization that endorses those, the threat to withhold arms from Israel and conditionality and stuff. So this is on the organizational statement. And I also found that when it comes to the war fighting itself, this may not be, well, I don't know. In terms of the efficacy of what it does to Israelis and the mindset with that. But I think on the humanitarian situation, it's quite different because there are several countries that have already withheld weapon transfers and weapon sales to Israel, including the UK, including Italy, where there's a right-wing government, including some others. But the US is a whole different story, right? And I think what made a difference in Israel is the language itself. in the letter. The threat is part of it, but the language, and I don't know if you've read it, the language was very, very severe. It's not a language that Israelis are used to hearing from Americans, and even though they were warned that they're going to get a very harsh letter, and they were warned, I think they were not expecting this. So whether I think some people can be cynical about it and say, well, they send this letter, but actually it's going to be in the transition period, or not going to do anything with it. It's just empty threats. I don't view it this way. I think in Israel they take it very, very seriously. And I think it's smart that you give Israel 30 days to fix this, because it's not something, as I said, Israel can't just wave a magic wand and fix the situation right in one day or a week. So because let's be honest, I don't think the Biden administration wants to get to the point where it bans arms to Israel. And Israel certainly doesn't want to be there. So this was a way to sort of like show, hey, we are very, very serious, but please, here, take 30 days so we all don't have to get there. And at least the impact I'm feeling here on the ground in Israel is that it's being taken very, very seriously.
Thanks for that. Maybe we can go a little bit more big picture now. After a year of fighting, what's your perspective on what Israel has achieved militarily against Hamas, and how much of the fighting is still ongoing, and how much destruction has Gaza endured?
Okay, so the destruction is the easiest part, right? We're talking about damages that are estimated by the World Bank in almost, there are different estimates between 40 and $80 billion in reconstruction costs. I mean, Gaza is destroyed. Gaza is destroyed. It'd be an immense effort to even start sort of recovery and then talking about reconstruction. In terms of what Israel has achieved, right? If we talk about the war, Israel's war aims, Israel, the first war aim was to dismantle Hamas as a governing and military force, power, governing authority in Gaza. And the second one was bringing back the hostages. And, you know, this was sort of like what the state of Israel had, but it's interesting. My colleague from at IPF, Neri Zilber, reported the Financial Times. He's a reporter he's a journalist with the Financial Times. He reported in December that actually the IDF, in the IDF's war plans, they actually wrote in the specific names of Hamas leaders that they want killed: Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Def, and Marwan Issa. So if you look at what Israel has achieved, it did dismantle Hamas as a organized governing and military force, right? I think 22 or 23 of the 24 battalions are destroyed in ways of like an organized organ, right? Like hierarchy, command and control structures, commanders, training. That of course there is Hamas, but Hamas as an organized force, and it was a very organized, disciplined force before, does no longer exist. Also, it has some pockets of control over different areas, but it's definitely not the de facto sovereign of Gaza in the way that we saw before. And in terms of the three Hamas terrorist militants that I mentioned, right, they're all dead. If you want to look at the positive, there were 260 hostages, 261. How many at the beginning? There were, so you can argue that 101 are in captivity, so many did come back. Unfortunately, not many of them came back not alive. The problem is that 101 hostages are still there, and Netanyahu himself said that approximately half are alive, and we know that it's less. And with every day that goes by, the likelihood of bringing them back alive diminishes, obviously. They suffer inhumane conditions, probably worsened after the latest, what we would consider Israeli achievements, but for Hamas, these are blows. And Israel hasn't achieved that. And also Israel hasn't achieved, but it never wrote into the plan. It's like, what do they want Gaza to look like? Right? What's the strategic goal of this? How does it end? Total victory, that the Israeli prime minister coined this term, total absolute victory. That's a slogan. What does it actually mean for the neighbors we're going to have, and they're not going anywhere, you know? That's one thing we know. And that's missing. But I would argue that we are now at a point where, if I'm paraphrasing on what Netanyahu told Israel after the Iran sort of attack and counterattack in April, he said, take the win, right? Like, by killing Sinwar, Israel has achieved something that is, and plus everything else, right? That destroying Hamas, restoring deterrence. I'm not talking about the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. I'm putting this aside just from an Israeli political point of view, right? Netanyahu himself can be convinced that he was right, that this symbolizes the victory that he wanted. This is sort of the ladder you can climb down from that big high tree, take the win, and start paving the way toward the day after, hopefully with a hostage, with agreement on the hostage and a ceasefire, and starting these discussions on the day after. And I won't say I'm like totally optimistic, but he gave a speech on Wednesday after Sinwar was found dead, and of course, he said doubling down, we're continuing until the end. But he did say there, it's the first day of the day after, which to me was like, oh, at least the first time he's willing to even like utter these words, right? Before that, it was never like, we're not going to talk about until we're done. So I do think we are really in a point where the timing is, I don't want to say unfortunate, but the timing is really complex. I don't think anything major is likely to happen before November 5th because of US elections. And there's also this Israel retaliation to Iran that's like a bigger thing that is supposed to happen, and Israel's holding off for a variety of reasons, which have to do with the US elections. But I am trying to be optimistic and think that because of the political situation in Israel, and it is what it is, right? And because of Netanyahu's coalition partners, he needs to sell them something, and killing Sinwar is a big something to sell, and this could hopefully take the off-ramp and unwind this war, because you can always find another terrorist, right? It's a fungible thing. There's always someone going to come. There's always going to be another asset. It's going to be another arsenal. There's going to be another booby trap, another tunnel. But for the most part, the big war is ended, and it's more just like holding the line, fighting insurgency, small scale, that we're seeing now. And still soldiers are dying, so it's still dangerous. We're still paying the prices from an Israeli perspective. And of course, the Gazan population is paying very heavy prices.
For sure. So it actually leads well into the next question I have, which is about the major obstacles to achieving a ceasefire in Gaza. How much is the Israeli government an obstacle in this? In what way is Hamas an obstacle? And how has this changed in the last week since the death of Sinwar?
Okay, I'll start with the Palestinian side. So first of all, we don't know, right? Sinwar just died. Hamas has been in sort of chaos even before that, right? We've seen its commanders one by one eliminated. Sinwar was the last one remaining, and we don't know. At least I don't know, but I'm speaking to Hamas analysts here. We don't know for a fact how it's going to affect Hamas itself and decision making. There are two options. First of all, I don't know how many of your audience, how much you know, but there's always been a split between sort of like Hamas Gaza inside Gaza and Hamas outside. Most of the leadership is in exile in Qatar. Hamas Gaza, which was the main force with Mohammed Deif, with Yahya Sinwar in the last few years, much stronger, not even like really disregarding Hamas abroad, has been weakened substantially. Most of them are dead. So this is one thing to remember. It's going to affect the power relations between the abroad group and the inside Gaza group, with weakening of the first one. Then there could be where is Hamas Gaza heading? There could be one of those like hierarchical arrangements, right? You'll have a head that is in charge of what's remaining under Gaza, and in Gaza, and that is likely to be, again, not 100%, but it's likely to be Muhammad Sinwar, who's Yahya Sinwar's brother. But there could also be just like fracturing of Hamas into 4 different groups. There are 4 different like power centers, one in Jabal, one in the city of Gaza, and one in the Nuseirat central camps, and one in Rafah. And, so this is where, and it could be splintered into different groups, and that will affect the negotiations. It could be on the margins easier maybe to get a few hostages back from splinters of right groups, because there could be a group that calculates, well, you know what, we're not deterred by Sinwar is gone, we're not deterred by Hamas, we're never affiliated with Hamas. We know of like 5 hostages that are there, and we're willing to negotiate to get amnesty and a cash award and get out. It would be much more difficult to get the full 101 and the whole ceasefire with the fragmented leadership, I think. If it's the the Mohammed Sinwar scenario, then we can be in position where he can be as hardline as his brother, but he doesn't have a strategic experience. He's a terrorist, he's a militant, he's a brigade commander, right? Like he's not kind of this. So the assumption is that he's going to be tough, and he's really not well liked. There are accusations against him of corruption and sexual abuses and like other nasty things by Palestinians, not by Israelis. But maybe he will be willing to compromise, not compromise on the big things, but maybe a smaller number of prisoners, or maybe he will allow for an Israeli limited remaining presence in Gaza. I don't know that this is true, but if he can, I think the optimal scenario that realistically the Israeli government is the Israeli government, and on the other side you have a cruel terrorist movement, right? What I would hope that can happen is that there's a Venn diagram that, even if it's very small where they meet, is that Hamas agrees to something that Netanyahu can sell to his coalition partners as a victory. And then they can agree on a hostage deal, a ceasefire, and then what comes next is the big question, right? Because Israel still doesn't want the Palestinian Authority, but this is the key demand of everyone else in the world for giving their support. So maybe, we can talk about specific ideas for having a civil commission or a committee that runs Gaza, and you have the Palestinian Authority has a representation in there. We need to find all these like political tricks to convince the politicians to agree. This is where we are, because really the solutions are there, and everyone more or less knows what, at least we need to try. But the problem is that we have hard lines, very different types of, but we do have hard lines on all sides here. And I hope that the next, that soon enough that there will be an organized international coalition that addresses this. It's hard for me, I'm not trying to be cynical, but also it's hard for me to think that anything can happen major before November 5th, but it's really soon. So
Thank you. I have another question, and I want to encourage our audience, if you have more questions, to submit them through the Q&A function, and we'll get to them soon. So does Israel have a plan for what should happen in Gaza after the fighting ends? What do you think would be realistic and optimal, and what do you think the worst case day after scenario would be?
It depends. When you ask, does Israel have a plan? I guess in Canada, it's like organized, right? There's a government and everyone's supposed to be having one policy. In Israel, it's not. So there are different people with different plans. If you ask Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, and if you ask big parts of the Likud movement who are now trying to organize a conference in one of the Gaza bordering community that was part of the massacre, they want to reoccupy Gaza, to rebuild Jewish settlements in Gaza. And they think that now is the best, that's what we need to do. And this is something that the Israeli public does not support, according to polls, but it could be a likely outcome, because if we don't do anything else, Israel would be dragged into it. So you're asking what's most likely. This could be very likely that we be dragged into I'm not I'm not a lawyer at all, but I'm not an expert on international law. But there's a difference between sort of like the law of armed conflict, right, where we are now, the rules of armed conflict, and what we're talking about occupation. When we're talking about now, when Israel is fighting, you have boots on the ground. Israel has some commitments. If we move into a military occupation and then maybe a civilian occupation, it changes the picture entirely. And most of the Israeli public does not want to see Israel going back and governing the lives of Gazans. But it is something that this government, or big parts of this government, support. Thankfully, Netanyahu at least says that he doesn't want that. Short of that, Israel would probably like Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates or someone to come and take Gaza off its plate and take care of that Israel will make sure it no longer poses a security threat, but someone else manages the civilian needs of the population. And I don't see this coming either, because the Emiratis and other Arab countries have said, well, we are happy to come and support and provide funding and more, even like boots on the ground, whatever is needed, but it has to be part of a request by the Palestinian Authority. We have to be invited, and it has to be part of the effort of state building, right, on the pathway to a two-state solution, which obviously this government does not endorse. So what I was saying before is that if I were to think about what every actor can tell itself to convince that they got what they want, I would like think more in the framework of a committee, right? Like the Gaza Civilian Authority, whatever you want to call it, transitional authority. It would be a committee that's composed of like a Palestinian Authority representative, but it won't be just like ran by the Palestinian Authority. And then UN, it could be United States, the Canadians if they want, Arab League, Egypt and stuff. And this way, I think some countries would be able to say to themselves, oh, we have the PA that invited us. The PA is a key player in this. But also Israel can say, oh, we got the international body, but without the PA, this is not a Palestinian state. I don't know if, again, I have no idea if this will work. I don't know if the Palestinian Authority would agree to this, because the Palestinian Authority can say, well, you got rid of Hamas, which is great for us because we don't like them. So now it's only us who can really govern Gaza, so we can harden our position. And I don't know. I don't know where they are. I think they have not been asked the question. But it would be good, and that's why there's an opportunity here with the new administration that's coming. And both sides probably can have a better job of using their leverage, not just with Israel, but also with the Palestinian Authority and with the Egyptians and with others. Because no matter who's elected in the US, and also if you look at the actors around the Middle East, everyone wants a cessation of hostilities. We're on the verge of a regional war. I mean, Iran is the big thing. We have the north, we have Lebanon, we have Syria, we have Iraq, we have Yemen. You know, in a sense, for Israel now, Gaza is the secondary or even tertiary front.
Thank you. I'm going to hand it back to Gabriella now to read out some of our audience questions.
Thanks very much, Shayna, and it's all very illuminating and concerning, I guess. I'm going to ask I'm not going to do entirely in order here because you mentioned Iran, and we have a question from Ricky Miller. How does the war in Hezbollah affect what's going on in Gaza?
I think there's a deprioritization of the war in Gaza. We've been seeing more troops, more IDF soldiers go up north into the types of soldiers, the makeup of the effort is up north. And that's what I said, it has become like a secondary front. What's interesting more in the strategic point of view is that Hezbollah linked its onslaught on Israel, right? The way it started is October 7th happened, and then October 8th, Hezbollah started shooting rockets at Israeli towns. And Hezbollah said, until you're not, there's no ceasefire in Gaza, we're not stopping. Well, what had happened is that Israel had a series of very successful attacks against Hezbollah, decapitating the movement in ways that I at least have not expected. I was surprised, positively surprised, very positively surprised. And so now you don't, no one cares what Hezbollah thinks in terms of ceasefire in Gaza to stop the fight, because Israel says we're on a roll here. We will continue. What I would hope to do is use this linkage elsewhere, say like, okay, we will stop in the north and everything, and with that, we get the international community to support us in achieving an outcome that we want in Gaza. This all is a big campaign against Iran, and where we are, and things here change so quickly on the ground. But yesterday, Saturday, a drone from Lebanon crossed into Israel and basically got through what I heard, because the military censorship doesn't allow publication of this, but basically a drone gotten into Prime Minister Netanyahu's home, private residence in Caesarea, through the window. So now there's a whole like, oh, they tried to assassinate me and my wife. And who knows if this is gonna affect Israeli retaliation against Iran. So we are in this is a very precarious situation here all around. I know we're talking about Gaza, but really when I'm looking east to, Tehran.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What I read was the drone hit some other house, but I guess there's still conflicting reports on it. So I'll go to another question here from the audience, and this is we're going in a different direction altogether. And this is why has the International Red Cross not worked to see the hostages? I think that's the main question to ask, because the other part of it was whether anything will change now that Sinwar has been killed. But you've talked to that at length, I think. So unless you want to add something, but the main thing is the questioner is wondering, the hostages and the International Red Cross.
Yeah, I don't think that the Hamas has ever let the Red Cross see anything. I don't think they let them see Gilad Shalit also. I just don't think Hamas allows that. I know the Red Cross was criticized heavily, and I'm sure there's good reason for it. But I don't know that it was in their ability to actually
Okay. So
to
it's
see
not
the hostages. At least that's what they're saying, that they can't force Hamas's hand into seeing the hostages, getting the hostages. I think they had so much of it is the optics of things, the messaging, and really bad things. I think they're working on course correction now, and they're trying to correct the impression that they've created before. But sort of like in the name of being neutral and to be able to work with Hamas when they deliver hostages. But there's also a question. They said it's unrealistic expectations of them. And again, my understanding is that it wasn't like they were offered to see the hostages and visit them, and they said no, that it's not something that they demanded, but they can demand it. I don't know. I don't know if that is true or not.
Okay, thank you. Okay, a question from Alida van der Ven, and excuse me if I mispronounced your name, Alida. Do the Israelis living in the kibbutzim around Gaza have progressive, liberal intentions favoring a two-state solution? How do they receive Smotrich's plans to reoccupy or resettle Gaza with Jewish settlers? Is it the same for Israeli villages and cities around Gaza? And then how do the Palestinians in Gaza view Hamas and Hezbollah? And what about in the West Bank? So there are three parts to this. The views
but it's
of
a lot
the
of public opinion. Yeah.
Yeah.
Listen, I mean, the kibbutz around the kibbutzim and moshavim around Gaza, and those who were victim to were mostly, very left-wing liberal voters. Many of them help Palestinians, right, get treatment in Gaza. I was hosted by a community, Ophir Lipstein, who was the head of the regional council, Mishmar Negev. He was killed, the first person to give, I think, one of the first few that were killed on October 7th, protecting his home. And the theme of that was September 25th. The theme of that conference was how do we integrate Gazans more into the economy of the region. And what kind of like joint industrial zones we can build on the border. So definitely, I mean, very progressive. And what it means in Israel is, is a two-state solution in the Israeli mindset, right? This whole like from the river to the sea in one state, it's not very much an Israeli discourse. So they were, and then they're very much opposing Smotrich's plans. I mentioned there's going to be a conference. It's posted in all the newspapers that Smotrich, and not just Smotrich, it's actually under the auspices of the Likud movement for reoccupying Gaza and resettling Gaza with Jews. And the organizers have decided to put the location would be in Kibbutz Nirim, and Nirim management, but the whole like the regional council head, and so they opposed it and said they will not allow this convening to take place in their territory. So despite what they went through, they are not willing to be, useful idiots and be ployed into messianic ideas of resettling Gaza with Jews. So I think with them it's easier. Most of the Israeli population, as I said, is not there. Is not there, but there's not like so much public outcry against it. I guess because it doesn't seem like now we're still, there's still a fight and the hostages, and it doesn't look like something that's actually coming. And I think that's why it was really interesting to have the Likud logo on it, because the Likud is the party of the prime minister, right? It's not just like, oh, Smotrich, who cares what he says? No, this is like the main party of the government. And they're saying that, even though the prime minister is not saying that. So there is opposition, and most of the Israeli public is not there. What actually happens, and if there's an attempt on building a settlement or like an RV that's harder to evacuate, I mean, for now, we see the idea of resisting pressures to also, they were like to pray inside Gaza and others, but by public, but it is still a minority. In terms of the Palestinian, it's very difficult. I don't believe in polling during the time of war. There were two different polls that came out, one by Khalid Shikaki and then another one that had very different numbers in terms of what Palestinians support now, both in Gaza and the West Bank. I'm putting Hezbollah aside because it's a Lebanese organization. It's not, I mean, they can think of them, whatever, but it doesn't really affect their lives in a very direct way. There was one polling that says that still a lot of support for Hamas, and then another one that says the Hamas only gets 6%. So very, very different numbers. It then became clear that the poll that got higher numbers for Hamas was actually manipulated by Hamas. They manipulated the data. It was the IDF found records of manipulated data inside Gaza, and there's goes like having polling. Who do you prefer in a time of war, when you're deterred by your government and you're deterred by the other's government? It's just not reliable. But there's no question in my mind, and this also would come to the US and Canada and other partners of, this can be an inflection point for Palestinians, right? Palestinians that really, I'm talking about like the average Palestinian, whose both leaderships failed them, right? You have a leadership that chose the way of peace. They have not been perfect, don't get me wrong, but they chose the way of peace, right? If you look at Abu Mazen, the Palestinian Authority, and it's different. They don't just want Palestinian statehood. They agreed to a two-state solution, meaning they recognize Israel's right to exist. We can talk about Jewish or not, but they recognize Israel. So they compromised on the big picture, and they chose the non-violent resistance. There's stuff in the JCC, in the Hague, right? ICC and ICJ and the Hague and other means, and can talk about the fact that they actually pay prisoner payments, and this could be incentivizing terrorism. That's all true, but them themselves, they don't support terrorism. actively, and they're not terrorists themselves. And then there was the Hamas, and this leadership, since the Oslo time, essentially, has not delivered tangible results for the Palestinians. I mean, right, they don't have a state. You said they were promised a state, they barely have sovereignty. The IDF is in the West Bank, there are more settlements, right? And then there's the Hamas way, that in some Palestinian narrative, right, the Hamas way was like, no, mukawama, armed resistance. And we might be willing to settle on like a temporary ceasefire, what they call hudna, which will be in the form of a two-state solution. But what we want really is the destruction of Israel. And with October 7th, they thought that they're like getting it, right? You have all of a sudden Hezbollah joining in Iran. It's like, oh, the dream could come true. And if you think of Yahya Sinwar, when they launched it, they said the goal of October 7 was to end the occupation and liberate Jerusalem. Looking now a year later, Jerusalem was not liberated by the Palestinians. There is a second Nakba. It's a catastrophe for the Palestinian people, right? Gaza is a catastrophe. And the West Bank, there are more restrictions on movement stuff. So you could argue that in the Palestinian mindset, Hamas did deliver. They got territory, right? They got Gaza. They got a crossing with Egypt. They got suitcases of cash. They got different things. The violence delivered until it didn't. And I think this is where we are at a moment for Palestinians to say we need new leadership. And my hope is that clearly the violent way doesn't work, but how do we make the peaceful way work? And for the peaceful way to work, the PA needs to do a lot of things. They need to do reforms. They need to become less a dictatorship and a government more deserving of the legitimacy of their people. But there are a lot of things they can't do without Israel enabling it. And without the international community really supporting them, not just by words, not just like declaring the state of Palestine. That's nice. I don't know if Canada did this. 150 states now, countries in the world recognize Palestine. Is there a state of Palestine? Is there an independent state? There is, so non-nominal. And, it could be an inflection point. And I hope this can't be just an Israeli thing, but I hope this all is orchestrated in a way where Palestinians can get the dignity and leadership and that they deserve, really, which Hamas maybe overstepped a little bit.
That's fine. Certainly important to hear. Important. Your views are very important on that issue as well. I just want to go back, 2 steps on the humanitarian issue, because that's sort of our subject. I wanted to ask you, to what extent are Israelis even aware of the humanitarian issues in Gaza? Because, how much do the media report on it? If you could
Yeah, I mean, you can guess the news. Israeli media really self-censors, so there's barely any report on that. Hasn't been for a long, long time. You all of a sudden heard one reporter say something, and immediately they're attacked everywhere on social media. If there is someone who says something, or there's a video coming, and from time to time, the horrific images that you see from Gaza, right? A burnt baby. We don't have to repeat this. Is awful pictures. If they get to Israelis, sometimes you hear, oh, that's unfortunate, but what can we do? They brought it on themselves, to the extreme of like they deserve it because they're future terrorists. So it's very, the dehumanization is appalling. Of course, there are people who like me think, but if I had to think of the majority, and I don't have polling on this, it doesn't seem that there's a lot of compassion and empathy on the Israeli side to Palestinian suffering. That's unfortunate. I think it's short-sighted. And this is why when I speak about it, at least with Israelis, and I do believe in that, right? I say, okay, forget like the moral imperative, forget you don't care, forget compassion to the Palestinians, forget the Saul side. This is strategic. If the Biden administration, right, the most Zionist person in the world, right? I mean, except for, right, out of the tribe, is threatening to withhold arms because of humanitarian issue. This is strategic. So think of as a self-serving Israeli. What's in your best interest? I do hope. Yeah, it's difficult. I will tell you that, but I don't think it's representative at all. I was at the hostage. There's the Saturday protest here every weekend, right? There's a protest now it's around the hostage families. There were two groups, and there was one of the hostages. They ended up going to another one, but there were hostage families there, and someone who was released. And it was interesting that hostage families did speak about the humanitarian toll in Gaza and said, not in our name, and disproportionate use of force. It's the first time I heard this spoken about in a public setting. Yeah, it was Tel Aviv. Yes, it was, but so maybe this conversation will be a little bit more welcome, but I do think that also for you as people who care about Israel, I'm sure you speak with your Israeli relatives and friends, and maybe they're less sympathetic to this argument than you all are. I'd highlight why it just does not serve Israel's national security interest at the moment.
So I think we have time for one more audience question. It's hard to decide which one to. I guess so. So we have one that's what. Even if the PA changed dramatically, what can you do if Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are sort of have so much power, and actually do they still have so much power? I guess is a part of the question.
Listen, they have less power because Gideon Sa'ar joined the government, so there has less veto power. I can tell you, and I'm not sure this is illustrative, but I do think this is an example from today. Today there was a group of Jews that went to Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is change of the status quo. It's something that upsets all Muslims in the region, and until now Ben-Gvir was doing it like at every opportunity. And today he bothered to issue a statement. I did not, contrary to what people say, I did not go to Temple Mount. And I think this statement reflects the fact that either the prime minister told him, don't go, and he listened, which until now he wouldn't listen, or that he told him maybe in other words, said like, don't jeopardize what we're trying to achieve with that. But the fact that until now, he kept saying, I'm deciding on a status quo, I'm deciding on Temple Mount, and he didn't do it. And I think it's because he lost the veto power. And I also heard from people that understand that he lost the veto power because of Gideon Sa'ar coming into the government. So that, in a sense, is good news. On the PA, I apologize for that. On the PA, yeah, it's not we're not in a two-state solution moment, despite what the international community wants to see. This government is not going to go there. Can we find ways to bring them in marginal ways to Gaza as part of the humanitarian effort, but not call them PA? I think you can. Can we stop some of the things that Smotrich is doing in the West Bank that undermine the PA, right? I think we can. It's not going to be easy, but my hope as someone who's also voting in this country is that this government won't stay here forever, and that will change. It does not change the fact that there's a lot that the PA needs to be doing on their own, regardless of Israel, right? All these reforms and stuff. And I would try to be sort of like these things are parallel and they can meet from time to time, but this whole like conditioning, we want to do reforms until that it's just not going to be constructive. The PA needs to be strengthened, and they can do stuff to really deliver better services and dignify their own people. And yes, when they do this, I think it will also help the international community stand with the Palestinians, tell Israel, you see, you always said they're incompetent. You always said they're corrupt. Well, we solved that problem. They're now better, and take away some of the arguments and some of the Israeli, not weapons, but resistance. So if nullify the Israeli argument, if you will. Of course, I would like a diplomatic process, a serious one, engagement, trust building, confidence building. I mean, I can imagine what you at Peace Now want, and probably it's not far from what I would like, but we're not there at the moment. So I would start small, but start small doesn't mean like thinking small. I think by starting small and gradual, you can achieve important advancements and also convince the Israelis that the sky doesn't fall when you give more leeway to the Palestinians, and then that would get us more. That's what
I said that was the last question, but I just want one very briefly. Do you have any thoughts on what Canada can do or should do?
Oh my God, I don't know. I
Okay,
don't know. I
you don't
think
have to answer that. You're not Canadian, but
yeah, it's hard. It's right. It's like the neighbor from the north. But I will tell you, listen, I don't know what Canada is very good at. I'm sure a lot of things. But if I look at sort of like the Palestinian weaknesses, and what I would do is sort of like say, okay, Germany can take on the textbooks, and Canada can take on I don't know, creating a more conducive business environment for the private sector. I don't know, right? Like, I think this whole idea of ownership and training, and it's not just money. It's more like the Palestinians need help. And to the extent that Canada can improve its ties with Israel, which is also like, they're not best now, right? So that is also something. But maybe as US Jewry, as a Canadian Jewry, you have an important voice. If you say, we care about Israel, we really do care, even if we have disagreements with the country, we want to help, we want to stand by you, give us something. And then you can join any other US-led efforts, but let's see who wins the election. I do hope that I have my preferences, obviously, but I do hope that both candidates would have a similar approach in the sense that they would like to see this war gone and leverage into something big. And I got to tell you, I have to go now, but I have to tell you that if we Israelis and Palestinians and the international community at large, right, if after this year, so much blood and destruction, and if we don't leverage this catastrophe into a serious effort to build a better future, we're all going to be at loss. Like, this has to be leveraged into something better. But we're almost like back to basics, right? Israelis and Palestinians, and they need the rest of the world.
okay, well, I'm going to let you go. I thank you so much, Shira. It's been illuminating and concerning and so valuable for us to hear your perspective, and we so appreciate your sharing your time with us. And I hope that your vision of what should happen does happen, and that things improve with all my heart. And I'm sure I speak for all the viewers. So thank you, and everyone else. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for more webinars from us. Goodbye and shalom.
Thank you. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach, yes.
Take care.